I wanted to highlight some obstacles for us to overcome and to kind of invite you to sit with these in the next week and think about how do we overcome these obstacles together as a community, where we are locally, but also knowing that this is not just work that's on our shoulders alone. So certainly I think, part of the problem is that purity culture. You look at someone like Mary, clergy love to point to Mary as, the highest aspiration of the human, right? Cardinal Dolan always says, we ennoble women because of the way we elevate Mary. But I think there's also a trap there, right? Because we show, for women in particular, there's two ways to be a woman if you want to be like Mary, either virgin or mother. And if you're not one of those two things, then where do you belong in the church? That purity culture, I think, can contribute to a lot of silence, stigma, and shame around human sexuality, rather than helping us to honor it as a gift, to be co-creators with God, and to take responsibility for it as a gift, but also a task. The culture of clericalism and patriarchy, I think, not only entitles and protects clergy, but it also disempowers the laity. When I was in graduate school learning about the early church, it was fascinating to see the example of the early church, before Constantine made the Catholic Church the official religion of the Roman Empire, when it was still a persecuted church. You saw a community of co-equals where there wasn't this hierarchy, modeled after the Roman Empire. You had women in positions of power. And I think that's really important because so often women are whistleblowers. They're the ones who are trying to speak truth to power. Now they're advocates and allies, vocal advocates and allies in the church. And they're resisting, the ways that they are being excluded from the decision-making bodies and rooms. There's that HR line, that personnel is policy. When only men or only celibate men are in the room making decisions or writing policies, we are leaving out so many perspectives and life experiences and preventing against that vision of co-equality and co-responsibility. And we see that in the top-down power structures, that this hegemony that we have in the church that does disempower, that kind of treats people and trains people to see themselves more as spectators than as participants or stakeholders. And just as an example, if you look at canon law, it says that every parish should have a finance council and a parish council. But if you note, the language is that those councils are consultative, that they can advise the pastor, but the ultimate power still lies with the pastor. And so in the system that we have, laity don't have as much real power as we might think, at least according to canon law. And even if you try to bring your complaints to the USCCB, they either defer to the local bishop or tell you to go to Rome. But there isn't as much oversight as you would see in maybe a secular organization, where there's a real clear chain of command, or this is where you go if you need to make your voice heard. And so we have to change the structures and systems and the personnel who's doing this. And again, I point to Vos Estis, Lux Mundi, where again, Pope Francis's approach seemed to be more to encourage than to mandate. And that has to change. I mentioned before the way that communities of color, low-income communities were targeted. We have to acknowledge the racism that's a part of the clergy abuse story in the church and the cover-up. Abusers were often sent into communities of color or low-income communities or to Native American reservations because they were isolated, because they weren't, they didn't have the same social power to be able to speak up or to be able to figure out, like, how do we hold this priest to account or this religious leader to account? And I think, really in almost every social problem that we have, the three real big threats are ignorance, people who just aren't aware of the problem or who are unwilling to learn more about it; indifference, that going back to the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite, the people who say, I'm too busy, or I have enough on my plate, or that's not my problem, or who am I to help? Just this feeling of unworthiness. I think that all contributes to the globalization of indifference that keeps people from going into the ditch and rolling up their sleeves, taking up the vantage point of the marginalized and the vulnerable and making it their own and figuring out, what do I see now that I'm in this space that I didn't before? How can I make these problems my problems and to work as a partner? And then finally, the problem of inaction, to say, all right, I'm upset about this, I'm concerned about this, I feel compassion for survivors, I feel outraged at what's being done in my church or what's being covered up, but I don't know what to do. And so, what are the tools in the tool belt that we can put so that people understand there are action steps that we can take to claim the power that we do have?